Behind the Headlines on WLIW. It's our weekly opportunity to sit down with the award-winning journalists who cover the East End of Long Island, do a bit of a deeper dive into the week's headlines. I'm Joe Shaw. I'm the executive editor of the Express News Group. We publish the Southampton Press, the East Hampton Press, the Sag Harbor Express, the website 27east.com, and Express Magazine. And Bill Sutton is my co-host, and he's the managing editor of the Express News Group. Hey, Bill.
Hey, Joe. Hey, everybody.
Good panel this week. We have our usuals, Denise Civiletti, who's the editor of Riverhead Local. Hey, Denise.
Good to be here.
We have Beth Young, who's the editor of the East End Beacon. Hey, Beth.
Hello.
And we have Jack Moats, who is a staff writer for us at the Express News Group. Hey, Jack.
Good to be back. Thank you.
So I want to kick off the conversation since this is political season, silly season, as I think the two of you, Beth and Denise, both termed it separately in editorial pieces in the last couple of weeks.
Work together.
Yeah, it was very coincidental that you both used the same term, but
about the same event too.
And it applies generally. But I want to talk about something that's changing in the world of journalism a bit, and that is endorsements, political endorsements by local publications. I did a piece for our newsletter this week, did a little bit of research, and so about, I think it was 10 years ago, when they looked mainly at big papers like daily newspapers, and something like 91% of daily newspapers did presidential endorsements 10, 15 years ago. That number's down to about 20 to 30% now. And the idea is that community newspapers are likely following the same trend and backing away from doing political endorsements, newspapers and websites. I want to talk about why that is, why we do endorsements or don't do endorsements, and what it says about our relationship to the process. So let me start. Denise, do you do endorsements, political endorsements?
I don't have any opinions. I don't really know. I mean, I might have a couple of times done here's how I'm voting and why. But, you know.
Not in the editorial space.
Yeah, no, as a column, I think, I don't know. It's, especially, we're so small. It's hard to, go out on a limb like that when you're also reporting. And I mean, the reality, like when I was the editor at the News Review, I was reporting as well as being the editor. We don't have like an editorial, like you guys don't have like an editorial board with just opinion journalists.
We do actually. We have an editorial board, but I have to say there is crossover between the editorial side and the news side.
And because it's a function of size more than anything else, I think, right? I mean, so I don't know. It's just hard. As it is, it's a struggle to deal with people who are running for office who, you always have, everybody thinks that you're on the other side, in favor of their opponent, which I guess is a good sign that everybody thinks that because, you can't be in favor of both sides at once. So that means you're like, I guess, neutral. I don't know. I'm sure you guys have the same experience. Like, the Democrats think you're siding with the Republicans think you're siding with the Democrats.
Happens all the time, yes.
But like, it's hard enough. And if you then, go that route, what happens then? I mean, you could say that about editorials in general, but I have really mixed feelings about not sharing opinions because I think that, one, we follow things a lot more closely than most people, and two, I like to think that people who follow things somewhat look to us for opinions about what's going on and, what the facts are and stuff. And, I think that why this is declining in the press in general is a result of people, I think it's wrapped into that loss of trust of journalism and journalists. And now everybody's got a platform for voicing their opinions too. So, which, your opinions can just then become part of the noise. And there are a lot of people that really seem to love to portray them that way too out there. So I don't know. It's a tough call, no matter what size publication you have. But I just feel like we're just so small here that it doesn't feel right to do.
I'm going to hold my powder for now. But I will say, Beth, the East End Beacon, you have a policy regarding endorsements, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to Denise's, and it's for the same reasons. I mean, there's a thing that maybe outside newsrooms people don't know. We have this editorial "we" in the editorial pages, which is essentially like the King's "we," but it's the voice of the newspaper. It's not the voice of any one person at the newspaper. And if you're a very small staff, Denise and I are often working alone. That voice is obviously me or her. In your newsroom, I don't think the editors aren't really out reporting, and you have that sort of editorial distance and are able to say, no, this is the standpoint of the people who have the institutional knowledge here, who have been here through many administrations, who've seen what worked and what didn't. And you have something to add to that process. But Denise and I are out in town hall every day, face to face with the people who we're reporting about, and it's just it's not helpful to you as a reporter to have one side wanting to talk to you and the other one not.
I think that's fair, Bill.
Yeah.
Bill, and our newspapers do endorse political candidates. I think Beth and Denise make a great point that as smaller operations where they are very much reporters and editors at the same time, we're also a small operation, obviously, but we do have a little bit of distance. And our editorial board, which is made up of editors, doesn't include the people who are actually doing most of the reporting, and we make the decisions on endorsements. So maybe explain our thinking about endorsements.
I think it's a time-honored tradition. I will try to explain our thinking, but I don't know that my personal thinking aligns with our we thinking. So let me start by saying that I think it's a time-honored tradition. The thought or the thinking is that that we are very familiar with the issues that are important in the races for local and regional office, that we're familiar with the issues, and over time we become familiar with the elected officials and with their challengers and with the candidates in covering a race, and then at the end having endorsement interviews, which we do on and off depending on the race. We will oftentimes interview candidates that we're less familiar with and come to a conclusion as to who we feel is the better candidate, whether that's the incumbent or a challenger. And here's where you and I are going to disagree a little bit too. I know that from reading your column and having conversations with you, you don't see that as the we, the us, the paper telling people how to vote. And I disagree with that. I think an endorsement is absolutely telling people how we think they should vote. And I'll give you a chance to answer that.
Yeah.
But I think by its nature, an endorsement is if we could vote as a group, this is who we would vote for, and so you should too.
I don't know that I would follow through necessarily with that last part. I think it is, and my argument in favor of doing endorsements is that it's no different from every other editorial that we write. It's the opinion of the newspaper that should be taken as a voice in the conversation. And when it comes to political endorsements, I think it is saying we have gotten together and had a conversation and reviewed the candidates and reviewed the issues, and here's how we stand. But I would not presume to tell somebody how to vote on.
You don't feel that by bolding the name of our selection in that editorial, that we are then saying this is who you should vote for?
I really don't.
What are we trying to say then?
I think we're saying this is our choice, having reviewed
But we don't.
everything. This is what we
But we
came
don't
up with.
vote. We don't
But
have a choice.
I would argue that any editorial that we write has the same problem, where we can say, we think the town should spend money on X. I don't necessarily think everybody in the community should agree with that. There are a lot of people who disagree with that and can make a compelling case on the other side. I have always seen editorial pages and letters pages as a conversation, and I always feel like, as I've said many, many times, I think editorials are not the last word on anything. They're to start a conversation, and I genuinely do not see editorials as this is the final word. This is who we think you should vote for, and walk away from it. I think
I think there may be a difference between a general editorial that says the town should spend, $12 million in CPF money to buy a property because it's going to, it's going to help the environment, preserve the environment. I think there's a difference there, maybe subtle, but I think there's a difference there between that and so should be supervisor, and this is why, and I think there's just an implied element to that, because there, when you write an editorial that says the town should spend CPF money, the general public and the general readership doesn't have an option there. The general public and readership doesn't have an option of, well, yes, I'm going to spend the $12 million to buy that property. We're saying the government should do that, or elected officials should do that. When you're talking about an endorsement, a political endorsement in a political race, there is an action that reader is going to take, hopefully, in voting one way or the other. But there's that action there. They don't have that same action with supporting what a town board is doing, or what a village board is doing,
Fair
or
point.
For an elected official.
does it change your?
I've always felt it was a little weird, the endorsements. I'm glad we do
Really?
them.
Okay, so you are not necessarily 100% on political endorsements.
No, if that's not obvious, no.
No.
I never have been. I don't know that, I don't. I think that we're very qualified to have an opinion. I think the editorial board is very qualified to have an opinion, and I think that I will say this. I will say that I think the endorsements that we write typically, while at the end we may select one candidate or the other, I think we go we try very hard to talk about positive qualities of both
Absolutely,
candidates.
yeah. I have to say
that if you're going to vote for this person for this reason, that's probably that's okay. But no, I don't know that we're qualified necessarily. I think we're qualified. I don't know that we should be telling people how to vote. I just don't. I don't understand.
This ambivalence is really, really fascinating to me, because I think it's clearly in our industry right now too, and I think a lot of newspapers have made that choice. A lot of news organizations have made that choice. Denise, I think, and Jack, I actually should bring you into this, because as a reporter, I'm guessing it does make your job a little bit harder when we endorse candidates.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with the consensus with Denise and Beth and Bill. I think that there is a sense that it's the same people giving these endorsements that are writing the news. And I just think that that's a little bit odd. I think it's a little bit of a dated practice. And I really liked what Denise had to say about, with so many opinions out there with social media and everything, I don't really know that ours get through. And I don't know that I really like the process of endorsements. I think I would agree
Really
with that
interesting.
consensus. Yeah.
There's almost a hubris to it, isn't there? That we are so much more qualified and knowledgeable to make a decision that we're going to try to sway the vote one way or the other.
But don't you think that can be said about every editorial we write then? Why would we give an opinion on any topic then? Why do we have an opinions page?
I kind of
well,
wonder the same thing, but yeah, I think that that's been touched on a little bit here, and I just think it's hard to separate the reporters from the editorial board, and I think that in these small communities, it's hard to, it's hard to really come out with a bold stand that's going to change a lot of minds. I think that when you know all these people and everything, it's the same thing with the endorsements. So I think I kind of agree.
well,
That's
I think as I said before, I think there's a difference between an endorsement and an editorial. I think we are we're pretty smart, and we are following the issues through our reporters and through our reporting, and being part of the community and having conversations in the community and having an institutional knowledge. Joe, our institutional knowledge between just you and I goes 50 years. And I think that that there's a judgment value that comes along with that. And again, I think there's a difference between a call to action for an elected official, an elected body, the community at large. There's a difference between that call to action and a call to action to the voter, saying, this is who you should vote for.
And I think on a national level, I think, if you're looking at like the Washington Post or these big papers that aren't doing endorsements anymore, I mean, if you're going to lose half your readership because you endorse one candidate, then that half of the readership that you've lost is not getting the benefit of your objective reporting. And what we really need more than anything else is an informed electorate. We don't need an electorate that's being told how to vote. And I mean, that I think would be the argument against doing national.
and I do think
at this point in time,
we have a real responsibility too to inform readers on our news pages, and to do things like debates, and I think we do those kinds of things to inform voters as well. But Denise, let me ask you this. Well, let me ask you and Beth both this. Do you guys run editorials on a general basis?
yes.
I did.
So does any of this, and I don't mean this in any way as kind of a gotcha, I mean it as a serious question. Does any of this conversation sort of begin to leak over to the editorials in general? I mean, should newspapers begin to re-examine? Because I'll tell you, one of the things that makes me nervous about that is at a time when newspapers and news organizations of all kinds are really struggling to survive, there are active conversations on the business side about whether we should sidestep being controversial because of the bottom line, that we can, not only does it potentially alienate readers, but it alienates advertisers, it alienates governments that sometimes place legal ads in our publications. I worry about that becoming part of the conversation, and I don't think neutering news organizations is a smart way forward to keep us important and viable.
That's a pretty slippery slope, right? I
That's
mean,
absolutely a
if you're going
slippery
to take that stance on editorials, then all of a sudden it's no, we shouldn't, write the story about
Right.
this issue at
XYZ
town hall
because
because it's going to offend somebody or some business or one advertiser, and
When you
and
when
that,
you start talking about writing something or not writing something because it's controversial or might
Yeah.
be controversial, that you had a real problem there. And I think that, in terms of fulfilling your mission, you know what I mean? I think that that's I think that's actually different than expressing an opinion. I mean, your opinion, the side you take on a particular issue or something might be controversial, but that, having to do that because it's the right thing to do is different than, I mean, that's the opposite of not voicing an opinion because you're thinking it's going to be controversial and people are going to, you're going to catch flack for it. You're going to lose advertisers or whatever. I mean, like that's happened to us, God knows, here and there. And one thing I got to say about Troy Gustafson, who started me in this business, he, and this I think is a key thing too. He said, don't worry, they'll be back. They need us just as much as we need them. Now, is that true today? That's like a part of the equation. that may have shifted, you know,
Yeah.
and that may
I
be,
would say no.
you know, that may be what you're feeling. I would say, yes, they do. And they may momentarily not realize it, but I think they do. I think that people still rely on us actually for, well reported, straight news. And, we need to protect that.
Sure.
I
And
think that's the
fiercely.
bottom line for me as
Yeah,
well.
I mean, economics never have an impact on our editorial pages. I mean, it's like if something's controversial, we're running toward it. But I think it's harder for web-only based outlets, and it has a lot to do with like the formatting of the web. Like, if in a traditional newspaper, the editorial pages you open to them, there is no advertising on those pages. Period.
And they're very separate from the news pages.
And they're very clearly, it's like the church in the middle of the paper. And it's hard to set it up like that on a website. I struggle with that in terms of like the formatting of all your posts is very similar, and the ads are along the sidebar, and you really can't differentiate the content in the way that you can in the print media.
Really interesting, yeah.
Yeah,
You
really.
can
I
take
think that's
ads
part
off
of
the
the
pages.
problem.
I never thought about that actually.
I
mean,
also
I
think
did
about
that last week actually. I took ads off an op-ed because I knew it was going to be toxic, and I knew that advertisers were not going to necessarily want to have their ads there, and I thought it was a prudent thing to do just from, like the purity of keeping that separated from, everybody else.
There's another thing here, and that is
Never
that
thought about that before.
you guys are both, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but you're also both sort of publishers and editors and reporters. So you wear all three hats. And when you're talking about smaller news organizations, especially web-based organizations, which frankly are becoming the more common places where people are going to get their news, wearing those hats all at once really complicates this even further, because Bill and I and Jack all work for a news organization that only I think we have 29 employees now, but that does allow for a separation of duties. I'm not out covering town board meetings generally. Jack is not sitting in on writing editorials. We're able to keep those kind of distant spaces, and our advertising department is on the other side of the building, and it never the twain shall meet kind of thing. So
I don't
size
deal
does
with
matter in
sales
this
at all.
case.
I mean, like there are a lot of people that do this, like independent online news, where they don't have a choice but to do sales and
Absolutely.
reporting.
Absolutely.
But I've always had the luxury, if you want to call it that, of having someone else who was doing sales, and I'm laughing at that characterization because for most of this time, now we have two salespeople, but my main salesperson for most of this time has been my husband.
Sure.
So where, you can't talk about, he's on the other side of the building. Sometimes he would like to be, I think, but but nevertheless, people call me for an ad or whatever. I say, you got to talk to Peter, you got to talk to Jill.
Sure.
People, call him. People often call him to complain about, a story I wrote or something. And,
Sure.
he says, he says, Denise, you got to talk to Denise. And then 50% of the time, at least, they don't call me. Because they're looking to put pressure on a sales guy that sells them ads,
Well, and another key point is I know you two, and neither of you would compromise your journalistic ethics in those circumstances, and that gives me great confidence that you guys are making those decisions. I can't say that about every single news organization that's out there, and I worry about the erosion of that commitment in the face of fiscal challenges, because that is definitely part of what our industry is facing right now. So I love this conversation because I would not in any way suggest there's a right and a wrong here. I really think it's a very complicated question about whether or not endorsements, whether or not editorial comment, whether or not opinion pages are really something that will survive into the next generation of journalism. It's a really interesting thing and it shows that it goes all the way down to the local level and the community level.
I sure hope they do survive, particularly letters to the editor,
Yeah.
op-ed submissions, because you know what, like it's a lot easier to blather on Facebook or just like mouth off about something, which is basically what people do. There are very few people that really write well thought out, reasoned things as
Substantive.
comments on Facebook. It's like wow, but that's not what you get from a letter. That's not what you get from an op-ed, and that's not what you get from an editorial, presumably that the publication writes. So I think that would be a loss of an important public forum. Personally, I know there's the forum of social media, but I'm not sure that how like valuable that really is in the final analysis. If anything, I think it's upended a lot of important things and important conversations as well.
I will tell you, we take the responsibility very seriously. I will say that for the most part, candidates understand the process and they understand that we end up making a decision, and most of them don't take it personally. Most being a key word there, because that's not always true. But certainly you hear from candidates that I think one of the things, if you go back and look at our endorsements over the years, we really do endorse both parties fairly consistently. We cross over all the time. We are not. And by the way, it's another complicating factor is Long Island in particular has a long history of community journalism that is aligned to one party or another. And that was true all over the country for a long time. But I think Long Island had party newspapers, and that was part of the journalistic infrastructure.
And still does.
And
I'm
still
thinking
does in some places.
One publication that we used to compete with when we had a Mauritius paper that was very much one-sided, and
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. I'm pretty sure they did endorsement interviews too that were pretty much straight down one-party ticket that that were probably less thought out and maybe gave us all a little bit of a black eye. I just want to tell a funny story. You talk about reactions to our endorsements, and there's one candidate, and I won't name the candidate, but we have never endorsed this candidate, and this candidate has won a number of elections, and tells us when we do endorsement interviews with this candidate that they hope that we're not endorsing them because their track record has been when we don't endorse them, they win. So
Yep.
I mean, so there's an element of that too. So that people will, whether we're endorsing a candidate, whether we think we're telling them how to vote or not, ultimately, I think the voters will make up their own minds.
The choice
no-
is clearly up to you.
Yes. And in no way do I see us as kingmakers.
Yeah.
That's not how I see that process at all. But I do think the editorials give you a chance to explore elements of the conversation about candidates that you just can't do in a straight news story.
Would you be able to do that? And it's interesting. Would you be able to write an editorial the week before the election without making an endorsement, but giving positives and negatives of both candidates in a race?
Yeah, just do Dunstats and gold stars for the
Oh, I
candidate.
like that.
It's funny because we try to do that for the races anyway. I
Right,
feel
but
like
ultimately we make a choice.
I feel like the approach that I've always had to the job is voters have to ultimately decide. So we should too. Like it should be up to us to make a choice. But I think very rarely when we write editorials as a news organization, as an editorial board, do we say a vote for this person is a bad vote. I don't think in most races I would feel comfortable saying do not vote for this person. Now, having said that, if that were true, I would hope we would have the courage to do that. But in most local races, it just isn't like that.
Good thing we don't endorse in the presidential election.
Yeah, well, and I mean in these races, I respect anybody who runs for public office. I think it's a thankless thing, and I appreciate the conversation about this in the spirit of behind the headlines. I feel like it's something that's happening right now as we speak, as we are sort of in the midst of doing debates and endorsement interviews and things like that. And we will be doing our endorsements next week in print for the town races. I just think it's fascinating the breadth of opinion that we have here, and I think everybody's got really good points on it. So that just goes to show you. I think that kind of, I think we need to be willing to have this exchange of ideas to keep this thing going. I think it's important for people to
If
hear.
the five of us were an editorial board, the decision would be no endorsements.
That's absolutely true. By the way, that's something I'm not sure people know about our policy is that on our editorial board, which is, I think it's 5, maybe 6 people, everybody has a veto. So if a single person, if we cannot come to an editorial that all of us can feel comfortable signing off on, we just don't do one, or we move on to another topic, or we find a compromise that we can live with. So
Or we fight.
Or we fight until we finally.
And we have, and I think that's honest.
Yeah.
I think that that because we do feel strongly. I think individually as editors, and strongly that we feel the weight of the endorsement, and I think that if we feel strongly one way or another, then then we need to make that argument.
I would
can't
compare it
remember
to
a time where we decided not to endorse. Do you remember that?
Vince
Have we ever done that?
Canusio, I believe, was the late Vince Canusio, who I had a very love-hate relationship with. Actually adored the man, but we did not endorse him one year. He was running unopposed, and we actually withheld an endorsement that people shouldn't actually vote in favor of him under the circumstances. That was as strong a position as I think we ever took on an endorsement. And he won comfortably and was more than happy to actually use our anti-endorsement in his ads running for office. So it just goes to show you, this is all a very complicated process. So we'll leave it there. I think it was a great conversation. I will remind people this is Behind the Headlines on WLIW. I'm Joe Shaw. My co-host is Bill Sutton. We're with the Express News Group. Our panelists today are Jack Moats, who's one of our staff writers at the Express News Group, Denise Civiletti of Riverhead Local, and Beth Young of the East End Beacon. Denise, I want to keep it on the upcoming local elections. The state actually got a very clear ruling in the last week or so about a very important change of policy that goes into effect with this election. Has some pretty big impacts locally, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, it depends on who you ask, but it definitely has big impacts in the sense, if nothing at all, that we are going to end up covering local elections for 3 years straight. Which I don't know about you, but I get tired just thinking about that. Like, so that's one thing. But the law that you're referring to is a law that was passed that requires local elections, like town and village elections, county elections, other than the sheriff and the district attorney, I believe, to be held in even years. And that is absolutely a sea change. The thinking in Albany was that people turn out to vote on those even years because they're voting for Congress, they're voting for governor, they're voting for president. And absolutely the turnout is a lot greater in those years than in the strictly local election years, which are traditionally odd-numbered years. And so the legislators, the Democratic legislators in Albany said, hey, this is what we're going to do. They couldn't do that for New York City because that is set by the Constitution of the state. They would have to amend the Constitution, so that's exempted from it. But
was the argument primarily about getting more people out to vote? Was that the impetus for it?
That was primarily it. People, will vote more people will turn out to vote, and more people will be engaged in local elections. And so that's a good thing. Now, the Republicans said, you just want to get more Democrats to the polls because the Republican local offices typically, in some places anyway, like all of upstate and or much of upstate and much of Long Island, the local governments are much more likely to be Republican controlled than Democratic controlled in the suburbs and the rural areas upstate. And so the Republicans fought this kind of tooth and nail, and they brought a lawsuit in Onondaga County, upstate, Republican stronghold. The state Supreme Court justice ruled the law was unconstitutional, on the New York State Constitution, and then the Democrats appealed. It definitely turned into a party, partisan battle. And the appellate division overturned the state Supreme Court, which the trial court.
And to be clear, that's the final word, right?
Well, no, this was the intermediate appellate division court, and they overturned the trial court. Yeah, and they said, this is not unconstitutional. The state constitution does not prohibit this, and it was grounded in, had rational basis, etc. And it said it takes effect. And then the counties and certain towns appealed to the New York State Court of Appeals, which is the highest state court in New York. And there was quite an interesting. I tuned in and listened to the arguments on this, and I gotta say, it was really interesting. And also, I gotta say that the appellate court, the New York Court of Appeals, to me anyway, watching this, it seemed really obvious what they thought of this challenge to the law. They shredded these guys that were arguing. I'm just saying guys, but they were, men and women lawyers arguing on, this appeal. And they literally, I thought, shredded them. And, but they took some time writing this, getting this decision out, and it came out last week. And they upheld the appellate division's ruling. And the supervisor who's running for a 2-year term this year is now running for a 1-year term.
And he'll be running again next year, right?
That's right. And then next year, and that's true of the council candidates that running for a 4-year term. They're actually going to get a 3-year term. And next year, the council candidates that would have been running the year after will be running next year.
I see.
So the candidates that would be running in 27 are going to be running in 26.
Within a few years, though, it's all going to catch up.
It's going to even out, yeah.
Right.
The next 3 years are going to be, brutal in terms of political coverage. Now, the arguments against this, and I got to say, speaking of opinions, but I thought there were some reasonable arguments against this, and one big argument was the local elections are going to get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah.
There's going to be so many candidates on the ballot. For one thing, it's going to nationalize, I think was the way they put it, although they didn't mean it in that sense, but it's going to kind of all get consumed by the national issues and the national personalities who are, vying for office. Now,
do you think in New York in particular, that was part of the equation for why the Democrats were in favor of this? That maybe they're looking
of course,
ahead to 26 and hoping that
so. Yeah.
an anti-Trump vote turns into a very pro-Democratic vote across the board, up and down the ballot.
Or, even just, more Democrats turning out. Sorry, Beth.
No, that's good. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's just.
Yeah, I think it's that, Joe, but they know that more, it's a blue state, more Democrats show up for those for those national elections.
Higher turnout tends to favor Democrats, generally speaking, right? I mean,
But is there a chance that this bites them though? Because it's the local candidates. Imagine that you're running for town trustee, and you've got to go out and raise money for a campaign, and everybody's spending money on the national campaigns, and they don't have anything left for you. Then what does that leave you? Does that take your voice away to an extent?
Going to have some
There's a
very
lot of
interesting
unknowns.
effects, I think,
Yeah.
on all of these races. Jack, I want to talk about the immediate impact in East Hampton town too, because one of the stories we had this week was election related, but it wasn't even looking at the 2025 race, right? We were looking ahead to 2026 already.
Yeah, so that was a great segue from Denise, because East Hampton already has a candidate, and that is East Hampton Village Mayor Jerry Larson has kind of unofficially announced, well, now it's official now that we've reported on it, that he's going to be running in the Democratic primary for 2026 in East Hampton. Kathy Burke
If there is a
Gonzalez.
primary.
Well, yes, he's going to screen, and if he doesn't get the, if they don't choose him, then he's going to run in the primary.
The incumbent in East Hampton is a Democrat, and East Hampton is overwhelmingly a Democratic town, right?
Yeah, and I think he kind of so basically this came from a bit of leaked audio. He made the announcement to some folks at CC Restaurant in Springs. And he kind of preempted, I think, any concerns about whether he was a Democrat by saying he has never been a Republican, which was a little bit interesting, I thought. So he is going to be running in that Democratic primary.
So we already have that race lining up for 2026, which kind of overshadows this year, although his potential opponent in any Democratic primary, Kathy Burke Gonzalez, is running unopposed this year. So she would only get a year anyway, right? She's going to have to run next year regardless.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're looking at here. She's going to be unopposed on the ballot.
Has she
And I
officially
think,
said she's going to run next year?
yeah, when we asked her what she was going to be, what her thoughts on Jerry kind of jumping in, she sent us a list of her endorsements for 2026. So I think that suggests that she's planning on running 2025
Well,
and
I think
2026.
we can assume she's, but it just I don't know that she's officially said it.
Right? Yeah.
I mean, she could theoretically bow out and Jerry could get the nod from the committee.
And theoretically,
when
the
it wouldn't need
Democratic
to be.
committee could choose him over her, in
They could.
theory, at least.
And it's worth mentioning that Jerry was planning on not making this public until the reason this was kind of an unofficial announcement was so that he didn't confuse people who are going to be looking for him on their ballots this year and like, oh, where's Jerry?
Right, next week.
Yeah, so he was hoping to do it, or whatever next week or month after or whatever. So yeah, that was kind of the thinking there.
And also, it means that the bigger race for East Hampton Town Supervisor next year may end up being in June rather than
Right.
in late fall.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sort of
yeah,
like the New York mayor race
Right.
this year.
Although
right.
you never know.
Yeah,
So,
you never
although
know.
you never know. Absolutely. All right. So, and we're all looking at all of the political races that are really heating up locally in the towns. I know that we have some previews, and I'm assuming you guys do as well, to sort of get voters prepared for going to the polls. And we should note that early voting starts on Saturday, October 25th. So a lot of people,
Yesterday.
yeah, as they're watching this either starts today or tomorrow, if you're watching this on the weekend. So get out and vote. I think we all agree with that. I think local votes are crucial, and it really is kind of
Not telling
sad.
people what to do.
Is that your editorial? Is that all you got?
That is our editorial this week. Actually, it is kind of sad that only 1 in 5 people tend to vote in local elections. So, it's a point
Well,
we made
I
this
want
week.
even your elections to change that, Joe.
It
It's
very
sad
well could.
that only 2 of 5 races include a supervisor
Yeah.
Mm.
that isn't unopposed.
It's also going to be really interesting when all of the town races are lumped in with the national races and
Yeah.
the effect that'll have. It's going to be really interesting. Okay, so we'll change gears here. And I did want to talk to Beth about a story you have this week about oyster farming and the state being involved. Tell us what's going on out there.
Yeah, so our office is here in New Suffolk, which is a really tiny place on the North Fork that used to be a hotbed of oyster shacks and people shucking on the edges of the creeks, and it was a very, very cool place that had like 2 or 3 lumber yards and a grocery store, and now it only has 300 people living in it. So I was walking down the street the other morning, and New York Ag and Markets was next to the waterfront setting up a podium and a display of oyster cages, and I said, "Well, that looks like a press conference. I know one of those when I see."
Big
So
press conference sprouting up.
right next door to our office, and we weren't invited, but we crashed the party. Um, so the New York State Ag and Markets is really doing a big push toward promoting agriculture and providing funding for aquaculture, primarily oyster farming, and primarily out on the east end of Long Island, where a lot of the oyster growers are. There's some in the Great South Bay and in other areas that aren't in the Peconics. But they had this press conference at the brand new, well, not some, the new land-based location of Hampton Oyster Company in New Suffolk. So New Suffolk's this very tiny place, but we have Hampton Oyster Company that's just starting up here, and Pico Oysters, which is right next door, and Cutchogue Harbor, which is out here. Peconic Gold Oysters keeps an oyster dredge out there. So there's an oyster barge with winches to go get their cages. So there's a lot of oyster farmers in the Peconic estuary, and this funding from the state, the first round of funding is going to be helping them with equipment. The farmer who's here in New Suffolk is using it for a digital oyster sorting machine, which apparently is a really big deal because it cuts labor by 10 times in terms of you have to keep oysters with oysters about the same size when they're in the cages, because otherwise the big ones get bigger and the smaller ones die. So they want to preserve all the oysters they have. So they sort them and put them in different buckets, to say, or cages, and then they grow bigger because they have like different size netting based on the size of the oysters. So
That's interesting. Okay.
because the little ones fall through. Anyway, it's very cool stuff, and after they've awarded this to 17 oyster farmers so far, and then they're going to have another round of grants, which is $3 million, which is going to be more for infrastructure. So this is equipment, and the next one is infrastructure. And they've actually hired a liaison to the aquaculture industry who's going to be working out of Denise's former office on Griffin Avenue in Riverhead. And that's the Cornell building. And this is Josh Perry, who used to work for Cornell's SPAT program in Southold. And he knows the entire industry out here. A lot of, that's kind of an incubator space where a lot of oyster farmers got their start. Between that and the Shellfisher Preserve, which is run by the Peconic Land Trust, which is also in Southold. And Southold has a lot of like little creeks and little different embayments and places where the flavor of the oysters is a little bit different depending on which body of water it's grown in, and you'll go to places where they serve oysters where you can have like the oyster equivalent of a sommelier explain to you why this tastes different than another one, and it's a really cool thing, and it's very homegrown, and it also, oysters are filtering the water and providing a lot of ecological benefits too. It's not like a fish farming operation where you're putting pellets of food into the water and they're making the waters worse off. Oysters
Yeah,
really
this is
help.
kind of a win-win to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a
So
latecomer to oysters, but they really do vary widely based on their terroir,
yes.
where they come from. And those are some of the most sought after oysters. I also learned this week, I was editing a story that I believe is for an article that's going to appear in one of our magazines coming up, that this is actually heading into the best season for eating oysters. That
Yeah.
the late fall and early winter is the best time to be getting
It's
oysters.
all the months that end in the letter R.
Yes. That used to be, and it's funny because most people see it now as like a summer treat that you have then, but it's actually off-season oysters have a different flavor, and they can be sweeter and plumper, and it's actually a better time to eat oysters, I'm told.
Yes.
At least
You
I
should.
read that this week.
It's true.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
We checked it
So,
out.
the-
Go on.
so the state's making a big investment then in the
Yep.
regional industry.
They really are. It's an initiative that the governor had a name for that I can't remember off the top of my head. It's like the Blue Food Initiative, something like that.
Cool.
But
Okay.
Yeah, check it
Yeah,
out.
we'll look forward to the impact of that for sure. Jack, we have a couple minutes left. I want to talk about a change that's happening in East Hampton. A big project out there is the senior center that they had planned. Now, what is it going to be?
So now it is going to be a community center. What that looks like exactly is a little bit up in the air still. But basically, for a little bit of background, this was planned as a new senior center to replace the old one, which is kind of falling apart. And it was a pretty controversial project when it first started, and it has continued to be so. When the town board voted to move forward on it after 9 years in the works, it was a split vote in December. And basically, it came to light a couple months ago that the two architects who were working on it were suing one another. They kind of had two firms that teamed up, and I guess there were some issues with the division of labor and finances and all that stuff. So the town board recently did two things. First, they voted to sever ties with those architects. They're gonna go their own way. And the other thing is they made an announcement, as you just said, that they're going to make it into more of a community center, basically. And from what I've heard in East Hampton and the community here, people are receiving that very positively. That's been a change that people have
It's
welcomed.
a big
People were
project.
really,
Right? I mean, size of the building is big, and it's also a fairly expensive project, right?
Yeah, it's the number that's floating around right now is about $30 million. And I think part of the thinking behind changing the use, besides getting a little bit of a fresh start by severing ties with these architects, is if you're going to spend that much money, it's probably worth it to have as many people included in, its intended use as possible. So with the community center, everything is very, very preliminary at this point. But Councilman Ian Calder Piedmont, he appeared at the Springs CAC on Tuesday night, and he was just kind of soliciting opinions. It's technically going to be in Amagansett, but it's right near Springs, and I think they're just trying to cast a wide net, basically, about what should be in there, and they've kind of talked about having it be a nonprofit space, having different nonprofits and community organizations be involved with it and have space to operate there. And just other sorts of stuff of what people would like to see and what maybe would be a little bit redundant.
it's still going to include services for seniors, though, right? I mean,
Yep.
it was, all along, controversial or not, there was no argument that East Hampton is a growing, aging population, and the services are really critical and needed for that population. This will still serve them to.
So yeah, it's going to still be a senior center. They just kind of expanded the use, I guess. And I think it's still going to house the human services department. So that'll be another use it will have. Yeah.
Big project, and it's evolving as we speak. So we'll keep an eye on that as it evolves. We are out of time this week already, guys. Thank you for a great conversation. Thank you to Jack Moats of the Express News Group, Denise Civiletti of Riverhead Local, and Beth Young of the East End Beacon. Thank you, too, to my co-host Bill Sutton. I'm Joe Shaw. We will be back next time with another edition of Behind the Headlines. Thanks, guys.